The wind in southern Utah has a specific sound. It doesn't just blow, it scours. It rushes through the sandstone arches and the slot canyons of Red Mesa with a hollow, high-pitched whistle that locals say sounds exactly like a woman holding her breath. In the summer of 1998, that wind was the only thing moving in a remote depression of land known as the Forbidden Canyon. It was a Sunday, June 14th, a day that should have been marked by the heat and the stillness of the desert. Instead, it became the day the silence of San Juan County was permanently broken. Two hikers, college students from Salt Lake City looking for unmapped trails, were the first to smell it. In the high desert, smells carry for miles. Usually it's the scent of sun-baked sagebrush or the metallic tang of iron-rich dust. But this was different. It was sweet, cloying, and synthetic. The smell of melting polyester and charred meat. They followed the smoke rising from a natural amphitheater of red rock, expecting to find a campfire gone wrong or perhaps a burning vehicle. What they found when they crested the ridge was a scene so surreal, so artistically horrifying, that one of them later told police he thought he had walked on to the set of a film. Below them, arranged in a perfect semicircle around the smoldering remains of a massive bonfire, were 12 figures. They were not running. They were not huddled together in fear. They were lying down, spaced evenly apart, like spokes on a wheel, and they were all wearing white. In the blinding midday sun, the white was brilliant, almost painful to look at. Lace, satin, tulle, 12 brides, 12 young women, some no older than 16, lying face up in the red dirt, their eyes open to the burning blue sky. There was no groom. There was no priest. There was only the wind whipping the edges of their scorched veils and the overwhelming silence of a wedding that had ended in a massacre. This is not a story about a cult suicide. Suicide implies choice. Suicide implies that the people lying in the dirt made a decision to end their lives. What happened in Red Mesa was not a decision. It was a transaction. It was the final step in a process that had begun years earlier, hidden behind the barbed wire fences of a compound the locals called Jericho's Keep. To understand why 12 brides died in the desert, you have to look away from the bodies. You have to look at the man who put them there, and more importantly, you have to look at the tools he used, because in Jericho's Keep, marriage wasn't about love. It was about verification. Sheriff Dan Miller arrived at the scene 40 minutes after the hikers scrambled down the ridge to the nearest highway emergency box. Miller was a man who knew the desert, and he knew the people who chose to live in its blind spots. When he saw the white dresses against the red earth, he didn't pull his weapon. He didn't call for backup immediately. He took off his hat, wiped sweat from his receding hairline, and swore softly. He recognized the lace. He recognized the specific, modest cut of the necklines. He knew exactly where these girls had come from. He had driven past the gates of Jericho's Keep every week for 10 years. He had waved at the armed guards who stood by the chain-link fence. He had accepted the jars of pickled peaches and honey they left at the sheriff's office during the holidays. He had told himself, like everyone else in the county, that what happened on private land was private business. As long as they paid their property taxes and didn't cause trouble in town, the folks at the keep were just eccentric, religious, traditional. Now, standing over the body of a girl he vaguely recognized, a girl he had seen buying flour at the general store just a month ago, Miller realized that his tolerance had been an accessory to murder. The girl's name was Hannah. She was 17. Her hands were clasped over her stomach, and in her hands she wasn't holding a bouquet of flowers. She was holding a surgical retractor, a cold, stainless steel medical instrument, rusted with age, clutched tight to her chest like a holy relic. Every bride in the circle was holding something similar. A scalpel, a pair of forceps, a speculum. This was the first clue that the authorities missed in the initial chaos. This wasn't just a religious ceremony, it was a medical one. To understand the horror of that Sunday in June, we have to go back. We have to go inside the fence. We have to go to a time when these 12 girls were still breathing, still hoping, and still terrified of the man they called the shepherd. Elias Thorne was not a prophet. He didn't claim to speak to angels, and he didn't speak in tongues. He was a man of science, or at least his version of it. Before he founded Jericho's Keep in the late 70s, Thorne had been a large animal veterinarian in Idaho. He spent 20 years treating cattle, horses, and sheep. He understood herd dynamics. He understood breeding cycles. And he understood that if you want to control a living thing, you don't need to scream at it. You just need to control its environment, its food, and its reproduction. When he lost his license for unethical practices, rumors of performing unauthorized surgeries on farm animals without anesthesia to test their pain thresholds, Thorne didn't fight the board. He simply packed his bags. He told his neighbors that the world was sick. He said that society had become infected with a moral gangrene, and the only way to survive was to amputate the limb. He moved to Utah, bought 3,000 acres of worthless scrubland, and invited people to join him in a sterile environment. He didn't promise them salvation, he promised them purity. And for families struggling with the chaos of the modern world, with drugs and crime and shifting social norms, the promise of a clean, ordered life was intoxicating. They sold their houses, they cashed in their savings, and they moved to the desert to live under Thorne's laws. By 1998, the community had grown to 200 people. They were self-sufficient. They grew their own corn, raised their own goats, and schooled their own children. And at the center of it all was the clinic. It wasn't a church. It was a white cinder block building that smelled perpetually of bleach and iodine. Thorne didn't preach from a pulpit. He lectured from an examination table. He taught his followers that the soul was biological, located in the blood, and that sin was a pathogen. To keep the community safe, they had to be constantly examined, constantly verified. Sarah was 19 that summer. She had been born inside the keep. She had never seen a television show, never eaten a hamburger, never spoken to a boy who wasn't her cousin or brother. She was intelligent, with a sharp, observant mind that she learned to hide behind a mask of pious obedience. In Jericho's keep, curiosity in a woman was diagnosed as a symptom of hysteria, a condition that required treatment in the clinic. Sarah knew the rules. She knew that the perimeter fence was there to keep the infection of the outside world away. She knew that the red dust of the desert was cleaner than the paved streets of the cities. And she knew that her body did not belong to her. It belonged to the community. It was a vessel, an asset, something to be managed. The announcement came on the 1st of June. The shepherd had posted a list on the community board outside the mess hall. 12 names, 12 girls who had reached the age of viability. Sarah's name was third on the list. It wasn't a proposal, it was a work order. In the outside world, an engagement is a time of joy. In Jericho's keep, it was a time of intense, suffocating preparation, but the preparation didn't involve dress fittings or cake tastings. It involved the clinic. Sarah remembered the look on her mother's face when the list went up. It wasn't happiness. It was relief. Her daughter had been chosen. Her daughter was viable. She wouldn't be cast out. She wouldn't be marked as defective. Her mother, a woman named Martha, who had aged 20 years in the 10 she had lived at the keep, hugged Sarah tight. "You just do what he says," Martha whispered, her voice trembling. "Don't fight him. If you fight, it hurts. Just let him verify you. It's the only way to be sure." Verify. That word hung over the community like a storm cloud. Thorne was obsessed with it. He didn't trust faith. He trusted proof. And for the brides of Jericho's keep, proof was physical. 2 days before the scheduled ceremony, Sarah was summoned to the clinic. It was high noon, and the sun was beating down on the corrugated metal roof of the white building. The heat inside was stifling, smelling of rubbing alcohol and old sweat. Waiting for her was not Elias Thorne, but Agnes. Agnes was the oldest woman in the compound, Thorne's original follower, his enforcer. She was the matron. In any other society, a grandmotherly figure like Agnes would be baking cookies. Here, she carried a ring of keys and a clipboard. She was the gatekeeper to the gatekeeper. She looked at Sarah with eyes that were hard and flat, like river stones. "Strip," Agnes said. It wasn't a request. Sarah stood in the middle of the examination room. The walls were lined with cabinets, glass doors revealing jars of tinctures, and rows of gleaming steel instruments. In the center of the room sat the chair. It was an antique gynecological chair, heavy iron painted a sterile chipping white. It had leather stirrups that had been worn smooth by years of use. Thorne called it the Chair of Grace. He told the community that it was where the spirit was measured. Sarah knew instinctively that it was a place where dignity went to die. She undressed slowly, her hands shaking. She folded her clothes neatly on a stool, just as she had been taught. Naked, she felt small. The air in the room felt heavy, charged with a strange predatory energy. "Up," Agnes commanded, tapping the leather seat with a pen. Sarah climbed onto the chair. The metal was cold against her skin. She placed her heels in the stirrups. She had done this before for annual checkups, but today felt different. The atmosphere was ritualistic. The door to the inner office opened, and Elias Thorne stepped out. He was wearing a white lab coat, crisp and spotless, over his work clothes. He didn't look like a cult leader, he looked like a country doctor. He had silver hair, neatly combed, and a face that could almost be described as kind, if you didn't look too closely at his mouth. He didn't smile. He put on a pair of latex gloves, the snap of the rubber echoing in the silent room. "Sarah," he said, his voice calm, professional, "you have been chosen for a great responsibility. We are going to build the next generation here, pure stock, free of the genetic drift that has destroyed the world out there." He walked over to the counter and picked up a metal speculum. He held it up to the light, inspecting it for dust. "But before we can build," he continued, "we must verify the foundation. We must ensure that the vessel is sealed, unbroken, ready." He turned to her. He didn't look at her face. He looked at her body as if she were a prize heifer he was evaluating at an auction. There was no lust in his eyes, which made it worse. Lust is human. This was mechanical. This was industrial. "Mother Agnes," Thorne said, nodding to the old woman. Agnes moved to the head of the chair. She placed her hands on Sarah's shoulders, pinning her down. Her grip was surprisingly strong. "Breathe," Agnes hissed. "Don't shame your father." What followed was not a medical exam. It was an interrogation of the flesh. Thorne worked with a terrifying slowness. He narrated the process, using medical terminology that sounded grotesque in this context. He spoke of cervical integrity, of hymenal status, of biological compliance. He wasn't just checking her health, he was checking her submission. He was establishing ownership. Sarah stared at the ceiling tiles. There was a water stain on one of them, shaped like a bird. She focused on the bird. She tried to fly away with it. She tried to leave her body on that cold leather chair and float up into the rafters, but the pain anchored her. It was sharp, invasive, and humiliating. Tears leaked from the corners of her eyes, running hot into her ears. "Dilated to 3 centimeters, Thorne muttered, noting something on a chart. "Pelvic structure. Adequate. Signs of resistance. Minimal." He stopped and looked up at her, peering over his glasses. "You are tense, Sarah. Tension suggests secrets. Are you hiding something from the shepherd?" "No, sir," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Tension is a sign of a rebellious spirit," he said, withdrawing the instrument with a careless yank that made her gasp. "And rebellion is an infection. We treat infection with exposure. We expose it to the light." He stripped off his gloves and dropped them in a bin. "She is verified," he announced to Agnes. "Prepare her for the cleansing. Tonight, she fasts. Tomorrow, she receives the sacrament." Sarah was allowed to dress. She felt hollowed out, scraped clean. As she buttoned her shirt, she saw the list on the clipboard. Her name now had a red checkmark next to it. But it wasn't just a checkmark, it was a stamp. Approved. She walked out of the clinic into the blinding Utah sun, but she couldn't feel the warmth. She felt cold, deep inside her bones. She walked past the other girls who were waiting their turn outside. She saw Hannah. She saw Rebecca. She saw little Mary, who was barely 16. They looked at her with wide, terrified eyes, asking silent questions she couldn't answer. She wanted to scream. She wanted to tell them to run, to climb the fence, to brave the desert, to take their chances with the wolves and the thirst. Anything was better than the chair of grace. But she didn't. She walked with her head down, her hands clasped, playing the part of the obedient vessel, because in Jericho's keep there was nowhere to run. The desert wasn't just a barrier, it was a prison wall built by God. That night, the compound was alive with activity. The men were building the bonfire pit in the Forbidden Canyon, a few miles from the main settlement. It was a special location, used only for the most sacred rites. They were hauling wood, crates of supplies, and setting up the perimeter. Sarah sat in her room, staring at the dress hanging on the back of her door. It was white lace, vintage, probably bought from a thrift store in the city by one of the supply runners. It smelled of mothballs and someone else's life. Beside the dress lay the token she had been given. Every bride received one. Hers was a pair of surgical forceps. It represents the tools of our salvation, Thorne had told them during the evening sermon. We are the surgeons of a new world, and you, the wives, are the instruments. She picked up the cold metal. It was heavy. It was sharp. And as she turned it over in her hand, a thought began to form in the back of her mind. A dangerous, jagged thought. She looked at the window. Beyond the glass, the moon was rising over the red cliffs, casting long, skeletal shadows across the yard. She saw the guards patrolling the fence line. She saw the lights still burning in Thorne's office. Sarah realized then that the wedding wasn't an end. It was a beginning of something far worse. The verification on the chair was just the intake process. The ceremony in the canyon wasn't about marriage. It was about finality. Thorne had been talking lately about the great sterilization, about how the only way to truly save the flock was to purify them completely. She remembered a conversation she had overheard between Thorne and Agnes a week ago while she was cleaning the hallway outside the office. "The supply is running low," Thorne had said. "The authorities are sniffing around. Miller is asking questions about the permits." "Then we accelerate," Agnes had replied. "We move the timetable up. Can the girls handle the transition? They are ready. They are blank slates, Elias. You wrote on them yourself. Transition. Blank slates." The words echoed in Sarah's mind. She looked at the forceps in her hand. If she was an instrument, maybe she could choose how she was used. The next morning, the day of the massacre, began with a deceptive calm. The air was still. The sky was a hard enamel blue. The 12 brides were gathered in the community hall for the final dressing. There was no laughter, no giggling. The mothers were there, adjusting veils, buttoning buttons, but they moved like sleepwalkers. Martha, Sarah's mother, was crying silently as she brushed Sarah's hair. "You look beautiful," she lied. "You look pure." Sarah looked at her reflection in the cracked mirror. She didn't look pure. She looked like a ghost. She looked like she was already dead. "Mama," Sarah whispered, "what happens after the ceremony? Where do we go?" Martha froze. She met Sarah's eyes in the mirror, and for a second, the mask slipped. Sarah saw sheer, unadulterated terror. "We go to a better place," Martha stammered. "A place where the sickness can't touch us." "Is it a place on the map?" Sarah asked. Martha didn't answer. She just pinned the veil into Sarah's hair, the metal pin scraping against her scalp. "Don't ask questions, Sarah. Questions invite the devil." At noon, the procession started. They were loaded into the back of flatbed trucks, the 12 brides sitting on benches, shielding their dresses from the dust. The men drove them out of the compound, through the gates, and onto the rough dirt track that led into the Forbidden Canyon. As the truck bounced over the ruts, Sarah looked back at the keep. She saw the other children watching from the fence. She saw the smoke rising from the kitchen chimney. It looked so normal, so peaceful. But as they descended into the canyon, the atmosphere changed. The walls of red rock rose up around them, cutting off the view of the horizon. The temperature dropped as they entered the shadows. The wind picked up, whistling its mournful tune. They arrived at the site. The bonfire was already built, a massive pyramid of logs and brush. But there were no tables for food, no chairs for guests. Just the fire pit, and a table covered in a white cloth. On the table stood a row of cups, small, silver communion cups. Elias Thorne was waiting for them. He was wearing his best suit, a black three-piece that looked out of place in the desert heat. He stood in front of the unlit bonfire, his hands clasped behind his back. "Welcome, daughters," he boomed, his voice echoing off the canyon walls. "Today, we celebrate the ultimate union. Today, you do not marry men. Today, you marry the truth." Sarah stepped off the truck. Her legs felt heavy. She clutched the forceps hidden in the folds of her dress. She looked at the other girls. Hannah was shaking so hard her teeth were chattering. Rebecca was staring blankly at the sky. Thorne gestured to the table. "The world outside is burning with sin," he said. "They are drowning in their own filth. But here, in this canyon, we have built an ark, not of wood, but of spirit." He walked over to the table and picked up a pitcher. "This is the nectar of the new life," he said, pouring a dark purple liquid into the first cup. "It will cleanse you. It will numb the pain of the flesh so that the spirit can rise." Sarah smelled it from 10 feet away. It didn't smell like wine. It smelled like bitter almonds and chemicals. It was phenobarbital, veterinary grade, the same stuff Thorne used to put down sick horses. The realization hit Sarah with the force of a physical blow. There was no husband. There was no life after this. The better place her mother spoke of was a grave. The great sterilization wasn't a metaphor. It was euthanasia. Thorn was culling the herd. He held the cup out to Hannah. "Drink, child, and be free." Hannah hesitated. She looked at Thorn, then at her mother, who was standing by the truck, weeping silently. Her mother nodded, a slow, agonizing nod of permission. Hannah reached for the cup. "No!" The scream tore out of Sarah's throat before she could stop it. The silence shattered. Every head turned toward her. Thorn froze, the cup halfway to Hannah's lips. He looked at Sarah, his eyes narrowing. "Sarah," he said, his voice dropping to a dangerous low register, "you are disturbing the sanctity of the moment." "It's poison," Sarah yelled, stepping forward. "He's going to kill us. Look at the cups. Look at him. He's putting us down like sick dogs." "Silence," Thorn roared. "You are infected. You are hysterical." He signaled to the guards. Two men stepped forward, reaching for Sarah. "It's true," Sarah screamed, backing away, pulling the forceps from her dress. "Mama, he's killing us." "Don't let him." She looked at her mother. She needed one person, just one person to break the trance. But Martha looked away. She covered her face with her hands. The betrayal was sharper than any knife. Sarah realized then that she was truly alone. The system was absolute. The brainwashing was total. One of the guards grabbed her arm. She swung the forceps wildly. The heavy steel connected with his face, tearing a gash across his cheek. He howled and let go. "Seize her," Thorn shouted, dropping his calm facade. "Restrain the patient." Sarah ran. She didn't run toward the trucks. The men were there. She ran toward the only opening she saw, the steep, rocky slope behind the bonfire pit. "Get her," Thorn commanded. "Do not let the infection spread." As Sarah scrambled up the loose shale, her white dress tearing on the thorns of the mesquite bushes, she heard the sound that would haunt her for the rest of her life. It wasn't the sound of pursuit. It was the sound of singing. Behind her, down in the canyon, the other 11 brides had started to sing. A low, mournful hymn. "Lead us, shepherd, through the night. Take our breath and give us sight." She looked back. Hannah was drinking from the cup. Sarah scrambled higher, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She had to get out. She had to find someone who wasn't part of this madness. She had to tell the world. But as she crested the ridge, she saw the glimmer of a windshield in the distance. A truck was parked on the service road. It wasn't one of the cult's trucks. It had a light bar on the roof. Sheriff Miller. He was sitting there, watching through binoculars. Sarah waved her arms, screaming, "Help! Sheriff, help us!" Miller lowered the binoculars. He looked at her. He looked down into the canyon where Thorn was moving down the line of brides. And then Sheriff Miller started his engine, put the truck in reverse, and slowly backed away. He was leaving. Sarah stood frozen on the ridge, the dust swirling around her. The realization was total. There was no law here. There was no God here. There was only the desert and the man with the cup. She turned and ran into the labyrinth of the rocks, leaving the singing behind her. But she didn't know that the poison wasn't the only way Thorn intended to end the ceremony. Down in the pit, Thorn watched Sarah disappear. He didn't chase her. He turned back to the remaining girls. 11 of them now. "The infection has left us," he said calmly. "Now, we purify the rest." He lit a match. The wood of the bonfire had been soaked in kerosene, but it wasn't just the wood. The ground around the girls, the hem of their dresses. When the hikers found them 2 days later, the fire had long since burned out. But the question remained, why didn't they run when the flames started? The toxicology report would later show that the phenobarbital had paralyzed them within minutes. They were awake. They were conscious. But they couldn't move. They lay there, paralyzed in their wedding dresses, clutching their medical instruments, while the fire, the cleansing light, crept closer. And Sarah was somewhere in the wilderness, a bride without a groom, a survivor without a home, carrying the knowledge that would eventually bring the whole system crashing down. But that night, as the sun set over Red Mesa, the only witness to the massacre was the chair of grace, sitting empty in the clinic 5 miles away, waiting for the next patient. The desert at night does not offer cover, it offers exposure. When the sun drops behind the Vermilion Cliffs, the temperature in San Juan County plummets 30 degrees in an hour. For a girl wearing nothing but a thrift store wedding dress and a veil, the cold was a physical assault. Sarah didn't stop running when the sun went down. She couldn't. The adrenaline that had propelled her out of the canyon was fading, replaced by a shivering, bone-deep terror that made her teeth click together in a rhythm that sounded too much like the locking of a cell door. She moved through the scrub oak and juniper, navigating by the stars she had learned to read, not for navigation, but for prophecy. Elias Thorne had taught them that the constellations were God's surgical stitches holding the sky together. Now, looking up at the vast, indifferent Milky Way, Sarah saw them for what they were, cold, distant nuclear reactions that didn't care if she lived or died. She had to get to the highway, but the highway was dangerous. The highway was where Sheriff Miller was patrolling. She had seen him back the truck away. She had seen the badge on the door. That image, the law retreating from the crime, had shattered her worldview more effectively than the massacre itself. If the sheriff was part of it, then the boundaries of Jericho's keep didn't end at the fence. They extended out here into the darkness. She was still in the cage. It was just a bigger cage. By dawn on Monday, Sarah had covered 12 miles. Her feet were shredded. The white satin pumps she had been forced to wear were long gone, left in a dry wash miles back. She had rubbed red mud over her dress, trying to camouflage the brilliant white that made her a beacon in the moonlight. She looked less like a bride now, and more like something birthed from the earth itself, raw, dirty, and desperate. While Sarah huddled under a rock overhang, waiting for the sun to stop burning the world, the machinery of the state was finally beginning to turn. The two hikers who had found the bodies hadn't called the sheriff. They had used a ham radio to contact a ranger station in the next county, bypassing Miller's closed loop entirely. By 10 a.m., the Forbidden Canyon was no longer silent. It was swarming, but it wasn't just Sheriff Miller's deputies. The Utah State Bureau of Investigation had arrived. Special Agent Valerie Kincaid was the first state officer on the scene. Kincaid was a woman who had spent 15 years working homicide in Salt Lake and Ogden. She had seen gang hits, domestic murder-suicides, and meth lab explosions. She thought she was hardened. She was wrong. She stood at the rim of the amphitheater, looking down at the circle of white. The crime scene technicians were moving in slow motion, afraid to disturb the tableau. It was the symmetry that made Kincaid nauseous. Murder is usually messy. It's chaotic. This was precise. The bodies were spaced exactly 3 feet apart. The hands were folded at exactly the same angle. "Sheriff," Kincaid said, not looking away from the bodies, "you want to explain to me why you didn't secure this scene when the call came in?" Sheriff Miller was standing by his truck, chewing on a toothpick. He looked bored, or he was trying very hard to look bored. "Didn't get the call, Agent. Radios are spotty out here. Besides, looks like a suicide pact. These fringe groups, they do this. Drinking the Kool-Aid." Kincaid walked down the slope, her boots sliding in the loose shale. She approached the body of Hannah. She saw the purple staining on the lips. Phenobarbital, she guessed. Classic. But then she saw the hands. "Technician," she called out. "Bag the hands." Specifically, what's in them? She leaned closer. The surgical retractor in Hannah's grip was rusted, but the edges were sharp. Kincaid moved to the next body. Forceps, the next. A speculum. "This isn't a suicide pact," Kincaid muttered. "This is a statement." She stood in the center of the circle and counted. 1, 2, 3, 11. She stopped. The geometry was off. The circle wasn't closed. There was a gap. A space in the red dirt roughly the size of a human body where the circle should have been completed. The tire tracks of the cult's truck backed up right to the edge of the fire pit, but there was a set of footprints leading away. Small, barefoot prints scrambling up the scree slope. "There's a 12th, Kincaid said, her voice rising. Someone ran. Miller shifted his weight. "Probably just a coyote drag mark, Agent, or maybe they miscounted." "I don't miscount bodies, Sheriff," Kincaid snapped. She turned to the horizon, scanning the endless expanse of red rock and sage. "We have a survivor, and she's out there in a wedding dress." The hunt for the 12th bride had begun, but Kincaid didn't know that the predator she was racing against wasn't just the desert heat. It was the man standing right next to her. Back at Jericho's keep, the mood was not one of mourning. It was one of ecstatic, terrifying validation. Elias Thorne had returned alone. He had driven the truck through the main gates covered in soot and dust and announced that the ascension had been a success. He summoned the parents of the dead girls to the clinic. He didn't let them weep. He didn't let them ask for bodies to bury. "They are ash," Thorne told them, his voice gentle, hypnotic. "They have been purified by fire. There is no body to bury because they have shed the husk. They are with the silence now. But in the privacy of his office, Thorne was unraveling. Agnes the matron paced the floor, her keys jingling like warning bells. The girl got away, Elias, she hissed. Sarah, Martha's girl. She's out there. If she talks... She won't talk, Thorne said, wiping soot from his hands with a wet wipe. He was meticulous even in crisis. She is infected. Who will listen to a hysterical girl who ran away from her own wedding? Miller will find her. He knows what to do. Miller is a drunk and a fool, Agnes spat. The state police are at the canyon. The perimeter has been breached. Thorne stopped cleaning his hands. He looked at the wall, where a framed anatomical chart of the human nervous system hung. Then we changed the diagnosis, he said softly. If Sarah is found, she isn't a victim. She is the pathogen. She is the one who killed them. Thorne walked to the intercom system that broadcast to every speaker in the compound. He pressed the button. My flock, he said, his voice booming across the dusty yard. The devil has entered our garden. Sarah has been taken by a dark spirit. She fled the ceremony, and in her madness, she has brought the eyes of the Gentiles upon us. We must lock the gates. We must prepare for a siege of the spirit. No one leaves, no one enters. We are in quarantine. Inside the clinic, he opened a drawer and took out a heavy black ledger. It wasn't the Bible. It was the logbook of every verification performed in the last 20 years. Names, dates, dilation measurements, pain responses. If the police found this, it wouldn't be a cult case. It would be a serial sexual assault case spanning decades. Agnes, he said, prepare the incinerator. Out in the desert, Sarah was dying. Dehydration is a cruel way to go. It thickens the blood, confuses the mind. By Monday afternoon, she was seeing things. She saw the wooden god Mutinous Tootness standing in the shimmering heat waves of the road. But when she blinked, it was just a dead cactus. She had reached Highway 191, asphalt, the smell of tar. It was the ugliest, most beautiful thing she had ever seen. She collapsed in the drainage ditch, unable to take another step. Cars whizzed by, shiny metal bullets traveling at speeds she couldn't comprehend. She tried to wave, but her arm felt like it was made of lead. A semi-truck, a massive 18-wheeler hauling livestock, rumbled past. The driver, a man named Carl from Nebraska, saw a flash of white in the ditch. He thought it was a discarded appliance or a trash bag, but then the trash bag moved. Carl slammed on his brakes. The air brakes hissed, a sound like a dragon sighing. He backed up, jumped out of the cab, and slid down the embankment. When he saw her, he recoiled. Her lips were cracked and bleeding. Her skin was blistered. The wedding dress was brown with dried mud and blood, but the veil was still tangled in her matted hair. Holy Mother of God, Carl whispered. Miss, can you hear me? Sarah opened her eyes. She saw a man with a beard and a greasy cap. In the keep, strange men were threats, but this man held out a water bottle. Water, she croaked. He helped her drink. I'm calling the cops, darling. You're in a bad way. No. Sarah grabbed his wrist. Her grip was weak, but her eyes were frantic. No, Sheriff. No, Miller. Please. Carl frowned. He had driven these roads for 30 years. He knew that when a girl in a wedding dress begging for help says no, Sheriff, you listen. Okay, Carl said slowly. Okay, no, Sheriff. I got a CB radio. I can get the Stadies, or I can just drive you to Moab, get you to a hospital. Hospital, she whispered. Then her eyes rolled back, and she went limp. Carl didn't wait for an ambulance. He picked her up. She weighed nothing, like a bird made of hollow bones, and put her in the sleeper cab of his truck. He hammered the gas, bypassing the local dispatch entirely. 2 hours later, Agent Kincaid was in the morgue in Monticello when her pager went off. They had found the 12th bride, but she wasn't in a jail cell. She was in the ICU at San Juan Hospital under guard by 2 state troopers because the truck driver had insisted that local law enforcement be kept away. Kincaid looked at the bodies on the metal tables around her. The medical examiner, Dr. Liu, had just finished the preliminary report on Hannah. Agent, Dr. Liu said, her voice shaking slightly. You need to see this. She pulled back the sheet. The burn damage is extensive, but the internal scarring, these girls didn't just die today. They've been tortured for years. Dr. Liu pointed to the pelvic region, scar tissue on the cervix, repeated dilation trauma, And look at this. She pointed to a faint silver line on the abdomen. Cesarean section scar. Old. Maybe 2 years. Kincaid frowned. Hannah was 17. There's no record of a birth. Exactly, Dr. Liu said. There are no birth certificates from Jericho's Keep. No death certificates for infants either. Agent, this isn't a church. It's a breeding farm, and he's culling the ones that failed. Kincaid felt a cold rage settle in her stomach. Verification, she whispered, remembering a phrase from a pamphlet they found in the girls' pockets. She drove to the hospital at 90 miles an hour. When she arrived, the tension in the hallway was palpable. Sheriff Miller was there, arguing with the state troopers guarding the door. "She's a minor in my jurisdiction," Miller was shouting. "I need to take her into protective custody." "She's a witness in a federal investigation now, Miller," Kincaid announced, walking up behind him. "Step away from the door." Miller turned. His face was red, his eyes bulging. "You don't know what you're doing, Kincaid. You're kicking a hornet's nest." Thorne. "He's not just a guy. He's the law out there." "Not anymore," Kincaid said. "Get out of my hospital." Miller glared at her, then spat on the linoleum floor. "You'll regret this. The desert cleans its own messes." He turned and walked away, but Kincaid saw him pull out his radio before he even hit the exit. He was warning Thorne. Kincaid entered the ICU room. Sarah was awake. She was hooked up to IVs, her skin pale against the hospital sheets. She looked tiny. Broken. Kincaid pulled up a chair. "Sarah, I'm Agent Kincaid. I'm not from here. I'm not with Miller. I want to help you." Sarah stared at the ceiling. She didn't speak. "We found the others, Sarah," Kincaid said gently. "We found the tools. We know about the phenobarbital." Sarah flinched at the word. "We know he hurt you," Kincaid continued. "We know about the exams. The chair." Sarah's head snapped toward her. The mention of the chair broke the dam. Tears spilled down her cheeks, but she made no sound. "I need you to tell me what's happening inside the keep right now," Kincaid said. "We're going in, but I need to know what we're walking into. Are there weapons?" Sarah opened her mouth, her voice raspy, barely a whisper. "He keeps the books." "What books?" "The verification logs," Sarah wheezed. "In the clinic, under the floor. It has everyone, the babies, the ones he removed." "Removed?" Kincaid asked, a sick feeling rising in her throat. "The ones that weren't pure," Sarah whispered. "He buries them in the garden, under the tomatoes." The room went silent. Kincaid realized suddenly that the massacre of the brides was just the tip of the iceberg. This was infanticide, systematized, industrial infanticide. "One more thing," Sarah grabbed Kincaid's sleeve. "The basement, under the clinic." "What's in the basement, Sarah?" "The others," Sarah said. "The new list, the ones who are next." Kincaid stood up. "How many?" 30, Sarah whispered. "The little ones. He says, the world is ending tonight. He's going to save them all." Kincaid ran out of the room. She grabbed her radio. "All units, this is Kincaid. Mobilize the tactical team. We have a mass casualty situation developing at Jericho's Keep. We are not waiting for a warrant. We are going in. Repeat, we are going in." At the keep, the sun was setting again, casting long, blood-red shadows across the compound. Elias Thorne stood in the center of the clinic. The incinerator in the corner was roaring, consuming the pages of the ledger. Smoke poured out of the chimney, thick and black. He looked at the anatomical chart on the wall. He picked up a scalpel. He wasn't afraid. He had prepared for this. The Gentiles were coming to destroy his paradise, but he wouldn't let them take his work. He wouldn't let them infect the next generation. He walked to the door leading to the basement. He could hear the children crying softly downstairs. 30 of them. "Hush now," Thorne whispered. "The doctor's coming." He locked the clinic door from the inside. He pushed a heavy metal cabinet in front of it. Then he turned off the lights, leaving only the glow of the incinerator fire. Outside, the sirens began to wail. Not one or two, dozens. A wall of sound approaching from the highway. The siege of Jericho's Keep had begun, but Kincaid was already too late to stop the first cut. As the convoy of SWAT trucks smashed through the chain-link gates, tearing down the private property signs, they didn't meet resistance from the guards. The guards had fled. The compound was eerily silent. The only sound was the roar of the fire in the clinic and the hum of the ventilation fans. Kincaid jumped out of the lead vehicle, her weapon drawn. "Breach the clinic, now!" But as they ran toward the white building, a sound erupted from the PA system. It wasn't a warning. It wasn't a sermon. It was the sound of a heartbeat, amplified, slow, thumping over the loudspeakers like a drum of doom. Thump, 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 thump. It was a recording of a heart monitor. "He's broadcasting," Kincaid yelled. "Cut the power." But the heartbeat continued. And then, over the rhythm, Thorne's voice spoke, calm, rational, and terrifyingly sane. "Verification complete," the voice said. "The specimen is rejected." And then the explosion ripped the night apart. Execution command. Transcript, chunk 33. The explosion didn't sound like a bomb. In the open expanse of the high desert, it sounded like the earth itself cracking open, a dry, heaving snap that slapped against the canyon walls and rolled back as a concussive wave of heat. The front of the clinic, the white cinderblock facade that had stood as the temple of Elias Thorne's twisted science, disintegrated outward. Glass, mortar, and steel fragments became shrapnel, shredding the night air. Agent Valerie Kincaid was thrown backward by the shockwave, hitting the dirt hard enough to knock the wind out of her. For 10 seconds, the world was nothing but a high-pitched ringing and the taste of dust. When her vision cleared, the silence had returned, but it was a different kind of silence. It was the sucking silence of a fire inhaling oxygen before roaring to life. The clinic was an inferno. The chemical accelerants Thorne had stored, ether, alcohol, propane, turned the building into a kiln. "The basement!" Kincaid screamed, scrambling to her feet, ignoring the blood trickling from her ear. "Get to the ventilation. The intake is on the north side." The tactical team, disoriented but disciplined, moved. They weren't fighting a gunman anymore. They were fighting physics. If the intake vents were damaged, or if the fire sucked the oxygen out of the lower levels, the 30 children trapped downstairs would suffocate before the flames even touched them. Firefighters from Moab, who had been staged at the perimeter, rolled in, their sirens wailing a counter-harmony to the roaring blaze. They didn't have enough water to save the building. They knew that. Their hoses were trained entirely on one spot, a concrete bulkhead door on the side of the foundation, half hidden by sagebrush, the entrance to the quarantine ward. It took 20 minutes to cut through the steel lock. 20 minutes where every second felt like a heartbeat on that damn monitor Thorne had broadcast. When the firefighters finally wrenched the door open, a plume of smoke belched out, but it was cool smoke, stale air from below, not the superheated gas of the fire above. Kincaid didn't wait for the all clear. She pulled a breathing mask from a fireman and dove into the darkness. The beam of her flashlight cut through the haze, illuminating a concrete corridor that slanted downward. It didn't look like a church basement. It looked like a fallout shelter. The walls were lined with shelves of canned peaches and bottled water. But at the end of the hall, there was a heavy steel door, the kind used in meat lockers. It was unlocked. Kincaid pushed it open, bracing herself for a pile of bodies. What she found was a dormitory, rows of metal bunk beds, military style. And on those beds, huddled under gray wool blankets, were the children. They were silent. Too silent. "Medic!" Kincaid yelled, her voice cracking. She ran to the nearest bed. A boy, maybe 7 years old. His skin was pale, clammy. She pressed her fingers to his neck. A pulse. Slow. Thready. Barely there. But a pulse. They were all asleep. Sedated. Thorne hadn't had time to administer the lethal injection. He had gassed them with an aerosolized sedative through the vents, a prelude to the final procedure, but the explosion had severed the ductwork before the concentration became fatal. The violence that was meant to destroy them had, by a twist of physics, saved them. One by one, firefighters and SWAT officers began carrying the children out. It was a procession of limp, small bodies emerging from the smoke into the flashing lights of the emergency vehicles. 30 children, all alive, all verified by the state as survivors, not specimens. But the architect of their nightmare was not among them. It took 2 days for the fire to cool enough for the cadaver dogs to work the ruins of the upper level. The clinic was a total loss, a twisted skeleton of rebar and blackened concrete. In what used to be the main office, they found him. Or what was left of him. Elias Thorne hadn't tried to run. The position of the body suggested he was sitting in his chair, facing the door, perhaps waiting for the fire to take him. The heat had been so intense that identification had to be done through dental records, which, in a grim irony, were perfectly preserved in his own meticulous filing cabinets that had been fireproofed. He had protected his data better than he had protected his flock. Nearby, they found the remains of Agnes. She had died near the incinerator, likely trying to destroy the last of the evidence when the propane tank blew. The mother and the father of Jericho's keep were gone, reduced to carbon and ash, indistinguishable from the debris of their empire. But the horror of Jericho's keep didn't end with the fire. It was just beginning. 3 days after the raid, Sarah was stable enough to speak to Kincaid again. She was sitting up in her hospital bed, staring out of the window at the parking lot. She looked older than 19. She looked like she had lived 1,000 years in the dark. "Did you check the garden?" Sarah asked. Her voice was flat, devoid of emotion. Kincaid nodded. "We're digging now, Sarah." "He liked tomatoes," Sarah said, tracing a pattern on the bedsheet. "He said the soil was rich there. He said, 'Death feeds life.' That's the cycle. Nitrogen." Kincaid felt a chill that the hospital air conditioning couldn't explain. She left the room and drove back to the compound. The investigation had turned from a rescue mission into an archaeological excavation. The garden was behind the ruins of the clinic. It was lush, green, and meticulously weeded. Large red tomatoes hung heavy on the vines, bursting with juice. The soil was dark, turned regularly. The forensic anthropology team from the University of Utah had marked out a grid. They weren't using shovels. They were using trowels and brushes. "Agent Kincaid," the lead anthropologist called out. He was a man who had worked on mass graves in Bosnia. He didn't rattle easily, but his face was gray. He pointed to a sifting screen. On the wire mesh lay a collection of small white fragments. To the untrained eye, they looked like pebbles. To Kincaid, they were unmistakably bone. "We've found 5 distinct individuals so far in Sector A," the anthropologist said quietly. "Neonates, newborns, maybe a few days old." "Cause of death?" Kincaid asked, though she knew. "Blunt force trauma to the cranium, or exposure. Hard to tell with the decomposition. But agent, the soil density suggests this goes down layers, years. They kept digging for a week. The final count was 42. 42 infants buried over a span of 20 years. These were the failures. The babies born with defects or born to mothers Thorne had deemed unclean, or simply born at a time when the population quota was too high. He hadn't just been running a cult. He had been running a eugenics program. He had been pruning the human race like he pruned his tomato plants. The discovery broke the silence of the survivors. The women of the keep, the mothers, had been taken into custody, initially as victims. But as the bodies came out of the ground, the narrative shifted. They had known. Some had watched. Some had handed their babies over to Agnes. The interrogation of Martha, Sarah's mother, was the turning point. She sat in the interview room, wearing a gray prison jumpsuit that looked too big for her. She wasn't crying anymore. She was staring at the wall, mumbling. "Martha," Kincaid said, placing a photo of the garden on the table. "We found them." Martha didn't look. "They were sick," she whispered. "The shepherd said they were sick. Their souls were wrong. They wouldn't have survived the winter." "You let him kill them, Martha." "He saved them," Martha snapped, her eyes flashing with a sudden terrifying conviction. "He sent them back to the waiting room to try again. It was mercy. You don't understand mercy." Kincaid realized then that there would be no satisfying justice. Elias Thorne was dead. Agnes was dead. The women left behind were so broken, so thoroughly reprogrammed, that they viewed their complicity as piety. They weren't criminals in their own minds. They were martyrs. But there was one person who had to answer. Sheriff Dan Miller was arrested on a Tuesday morning. He was eating breakfast at the diner in Monticello when the state police walked in. He didn't fight. He looked almost relieved. The charges were extensive: obstruction of justice, accepting bribes, accessory to statutory rape, and 42 counts of failure to report a death. The search of his home had revealed a safe full of cash, tithes from Thorne, and a ledger of his own, documenting the gifts he had received in exchange for looking the other way. Miller's defense was pathetic. "I didn't know," he told the jury. "I thought they were just weirdos. I didn't know about the babies." But Sarah testified. She walked into the courtroom wearing a simple blue dress, leaning on a cane because her feet were still healing. She didn't look at Miller. She looked at the jury. "He saw me," she said, her voice clear and strong in the quiet room. "I was on the ridge. I was screaming. He looked right at me. He looked at the fire, and he put his truck in reverse." That image, The law backing away sealed his fate. Miller was sentenced to 40 years. He would die in prison, a man who had sold his badge for jars of honey and a quiet life. The aftermath of Jericho's keep was messy. The state took custody of the children. They were scattered into foster homes, therapy programs, and special schools. Deprogramming a child who has never known the outside world takes years. Some of them adapted. They discovered video games, ice cream, and the concept of privacy. Others struggled, hoarding food under their pillows and waking up screaming about the verification. The land itself was seized by the state. The ruins of the clinic were bulldozed. The fences were torn down. The garden was excavated until nothing remained but a crater, then filled with clean dirt and seeded with native grass. They wanted to erase the scar, but memories don't decompose like bone. 5 years later, in 2003, Valerie Kincaid drove out to the site one last time. She was retiring. She wanted to see it empty. The wind was blowing through the canyon, the same hollow whistle. The sagebrush had grown back, covering the raw earth where the compound had stood. There was nothing left to indicate that 200 people had lived here, or that 12 brides had died in the canyon nearby. She saw a figure standing near the spot where the main gate used to be. It was Sarah. Sarah was 24 now. She was studying nursing at the university in Salt Lake. A fierce, ironic choice, Kincaid thought, reclaiming the medical tools that had been used to torture her. "Agent Kincaid," Sarah said, not turning around. She was watching a hawk circle the thermals. "Sarah, you doing okay?" "I passed my anatomy final," Sarah said. "I know the names of all the bones now. The real names, not the ones he made up." "That's good." Sarah turned. Her face was scarred from the sun and the stress, but her eyes were clear. "I came to say goodbye to her, to Hannah, to all of them, and to the girl I was." Sarah kicked the red dust with her boot. "People ask me if I forgive him, or my mother. Do you?" "Forgiveness is a luxury," Sarah said. "I can't afford it yet. I'm still paying for my own life. Every time I make a choice, what to eat, where to go, who to touch, it feels stolen, like I'm getting away with something." She looked at the empty horizon. "He wanted to verify us, to make sure we were real, but he was wrong about where the soul is. It's not in the blood. It's not in the cervix." "Where is it?" Kincaid asked. Sarah smiled, a small, hard smile. "It's in the no. It's in the refusal. The moment I said no to the cup. That was the first time I was ever really alive." Sarah walked back to her car, a beat-up Honda Civic full of textbooks. She drove away, leaving a trail of dust that hung in the air long after she was gone. Kincaid stayed for a moment longer. She listened to the wind. For years, she had heard the screams of the dying in her nightmares. But today, the canyon was just a canyon. The rocks were just rocks. The monster was dead, and the girl had driven away. The story of the Red Mesa Massacre is often told as a cautionary tale about religious extremism, but that misses the point. It wasn't about God. It was about men who believe they own the world and the women who eventually burn that world down to save themselves. In the end, the only verification that mattered wasn't found in a ledger or a medical exam. It was found on a highway at midnight in the hand of a girl clutching a pair of forceps, deciding that she would rather die in the dirt than live in the cage. The wind picked up, scouring the red rock, erasing the last of the footprints. The desert keeps its secrets, but it doesn't keep them forever. Eventually, everything comes to the surface.